Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. We have another great guest today, and for such episodes, I always add a disclaimer that I do not take a stance for or against any guest's political views. Episodes are for anybody of any political persuasion. So, political parties have been a staple of the American political system only a handful of years after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. They came around in about the third or fourth Congress. Yet they have also been a source of consternation for many voters, and a big reason why many choose to identify as independent. Even so, a lot of people still identify as Democrats or Republicans, or at least lean towards them, and the two parties make up the vast majority of elected seats that have partisan elections. But could issues with the two-party system and frustrations bubble up to the point that the future of American politics sees the dissolution of parties? Well, that's what today's guest, Metin Pekin, is here to discuss. Metin is the author of the book Breaking Democracy's Chains, Freeing and Fortifying Democracy Against Hidden Capture, which argues that parties are a bottleneck and calls for, quote, a no-party democracy rooted in direct accountability, genuine representation, and the complete removal of party machinery from government. He's also an entrepreneur who founded and grew several companies and has a BA in political economy from the University of Greenwich. So let's talk to Metin and get more insight into his thinking and discuss whether a partyless future in American politics is possible. So please welcome Metin to the show. Thanks for coming on, Metin. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you for the invite, and thank you for having me. I'm very well, thank you. Yes, looking forward to this.
Fantastic. Awesome. And Metin's actually over in the UK. So I believe he is my first international guest I've had on here. So it'll be an interesting perspective. So first up, Metin, I like to get to the genesis of why my guests are involved in what they do. And before we get to the book, why did you get involved in general in this research and discussion about political parties and whether democracies can function without them? And what makes you so invested in this topic?
Okay, so I suppose my interest in this subject began at university, where I studied political economy. The course has exposed me to different forms of governance and ideas such as Marxism, exploitation, surplus value, class struggle. So after uni, I've kind of parked that up a bit. After uni, I went into business, and I was fortunate enough to grow a successful business and number of businesses. So that combination of education and the business experience kind of allowed me to see issues in real life, not just in theory. So you observe these things and you see these things at work as well. And over time, I suppose I've begun noticing something striking in politics. Even though two main parties kind of present themselves as complete opposites, on many key issues, I've noticed there was very little difference between them. So that was kind of saying, well, hang on a minute, but there's something not right here. And in recent years, wanting to kind of dig a bit deeper into this problem, the problems with democratic problems, representation problems that we have, I came across the Federalist Papers written by founding fathers. And what struck me was the fact that how strongly the American founding fathers warned against factions and the party politics. And I suppose that was the eureka moment. I said, right, okay. So what I'd come to see as being the problem in modern democracies was still a problem 250 years ago at birth of American democracy. So that kind of reassured me to say, your diagnosis is right here. Political parties are the problem here. And then the real challenge became, I suppose, a practical one. What could replace political parties? And that's what's ultimately led me to write Breaking Democracy's Chains.
Interesting. You know, it is, the Federalist Papers are just such a fascinating set of documents to read. And I think a lot of people could do well with reading them again. Maybe perhaps modernizing the language a little bit, because sometimes it could be a little harder to parse through because you're talking about how they used language 250 years ago. But at the same time, just the amount of prescience, and of course, these are they were human beings too, they're not infallible, but the amount of prescience that they had about the future and problems of that day that were going to continue to be problems of our day is just such a fascinating aspect to a lot of these founding
Prophecy,
fathers. Yeah.
prophecy,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. In a sense, they are
Yeah,
prophecies.
yeah,
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 exactly.
yeah.
So now leading into your book, I mentioned a little bit of what it's about in the intro, but let's hear it in your own words. Obviously, I don't want you to give it all away. You want people to see the book, but why write this book and what is it ultimately about?
Okay, so why I wrote the book? I suppose I wrote the book because I believe in democracy and I believe it's a precious and a noble idea. Because without true democracy, society drifts towards dictatorship of one form or another. So I wanted to give something back to the wider community by contributing to this debate because the community has given me so much. And what I want to say is I certainly did not write it for financial reward, or I have an ambition of becoming a commentator or a serial author or a writer and what have you. So it was just done as my way of saying thank you to the society and making a contribution to this debate because I see democracy being such a precious and noble idea. Now, in terms of what is it about, in brief terms, I suppose what I could say, the central argument of the book is that the party system is the reason democracy is no longer delivering genuine representation. So I believe they're the core reason. And like we've said earlier, 250 years ago, there was prophecies that they will subvert the will of the people. Broadly speaking, the book argues that democracy has been gradually captured by wealthy and, I suppose, organized elites via the political parties, through political parties. I suppose 250 years ago, during the founding fathers era, parties would have been uh, a practical necessity because it was low information era. So they were needed to help organize political competition. But in this day and age, a more responsive, a more accountable form of democracy is possible without them. That's what the book argues and kind of shows.
That's an interesting take. I don't know if I've necessarily heard somebody say that political parties were necessary then, but now we need to get rid of them. Usually I just hear it as you need political parties, and it doesn't really make a difference what era it is, or people say that we just never should have parties, period. So I think that's an interesting way to look at it. And there are a lot of incentives for party formation, and we'll talk a little bit more about those coming up in a few questions. But
Can I
there's
just
definitely a lot of people. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I just want to kind of say something about this so that it's abundantly clear. We need to try to imagine what the world was like 250 years ago. There was no internet, certainly no mobile phones. There was no television. I don't know if there was radio. There may have even not been radio at that time because these are recent technologies. So you needed an institution to give the cues to people as to what they stand for and organize people and motivate people. But the era that we live in now, information is abundantly available. The communication is instant, as we are doing across the ocean from UK to United States. So those kind of requirements are no longer here. So it's about time we at least debate it and say, well, do we need political parties?
Yeah, it's there's definitely a lot of people that share your opinion. Of course, for me, I don't necessarily get into that, or at least not publicly. I have my
Yeah.
own ideas about that, but there's certainly uh, a lot of people that feel the same way that you do. But diving deeper, excuse me,
Yes.
into your book, I was looking at the Amazon description for it, and you basically say that cosmetic reforms can't fix this problem. So I want to get a little bit more of your take on what are some examples of these cosmetic reforms and why do you believe they are ineffective?
By cosmetic, I mean kinds of reforms that try to improve the existing party system. I suppose we're all familiar with those. Some people suggest reforms such as open primaries, ranked choice voting, and so on and so forth. So the list goes on. I suppose some advocate even more parties. to come into the equation. So 2 parties are not enough. So maybe we'll improve the system with 3 parties or 4 parties. Some very clever folks suggest technology, AI, to get people more involved and understand the legislation, what's being debated, and kind of give feedback to the representatives as to what their constituents think and what have you. I believe these reforms will improve certain aspects of the system, but they don't deal with the root cause of the problem. These current problems that we see in democracies, these reforms do not deal with that root cause. And my view is, if diagnosis is wrong, then the treatment couldn't possibly work. The treatment cannot work because you've diagnosed it wrong. So I suppose we could say this is why democratic or democracy failures have persisted for all these decades, because it's not just a current problem that's just occurred. We've had these problems years ago. That's why these reforms had come about, but unfortunately it did not fix the problems. Take, for example, the money in politics. There have been repeated attempts to curb the influence of money in politics, and you and I both know, and most of your listeners would know. But the entrenched elite that I refer to have consistently found these loopholes and new ways to preserve their influence on politics, on these parties. So, in my view, only a structural reform has a chance to fix this problem from the root cause, because if we identify the root cause right, then we can remedy it correctly. And I believe root cause is the political parties. What I want to kind of maybe add to this, you use a bit of an analogy here for your audiences. Money will always find, or money will always seek to influence politics and politicians because it's in their interest. So that's human nature. The system, the problem is how resistant is the system to that money. Now, political parties are a perfect host, if you like, for the money. And once money and political parties kind of fuse together, you've got a tumor. You've got a tumor. It doesn't just stay within the government. It has spread. Unfortunately, it has spread into the media. Because what do we see in the media these days? It's consolidated. 60-70% of it is owned by few corporations. And they, as the name escapes me, Noam Chomsky, as he writes in Manufacturing Consent. So the government has enabled the media landscape that we are in today, and therefore the disease hasn't been contained within the heart of the government. It's spread to the media. It's spread into the schools through these donations and so on and so forth. It's even spread into the judiciary because we have been polarized, and everything is based on that polarization. Each group sees the other as existential threat. So that's my problem, and that's the root cause. The political parties are the root cause here. So if you want the tumor, if you want the patient to get better, you really need to take the tumor out, in my view, and then start undoing the damage that is done to the whole body of the system.
So it's for you, it's not even just two-party system is bad. A lot of people would agree with that, but you would also say that even in some of these countries that have 3 or more competitive parties, like I think Germany would be considered one of those. So even those you would say are not much better. They're basically still dealing with the same issues then?
100%. And let me give you a couple of examples. In Europe, if you look at Netherlands, they have so many weak governments. France have had so many prime ministers in this last year or so. If you look at Israel, coalitions disproportionately influenced by the minority partner. So, yes, my view is more parties, more problems.
Interesting. I know some people would argue that, well, we need to just have a third party to contend with Democrats or Republicans over here. For you, it's actually really just basically the same issue. Gotcha.
Yeah.
So to dig a little bit deeper into this vision of yours for having a partyless future, if we were to get rid of parties in America, what is your vision of what that would look like? So would they work like what we have, like a lot of local places have nonpartisan elections? So would it look something like that? Would it be ranked choice, proportional representation, or something else, a combination of the above? What exactly would these elections look like?
Okay, so the democracies are not uniform. What we have in UK is parliamentary democracy. What you have over there is presidential democracy. Your presidential democracy is different to the presidential democracy in France. So there's no one uniform kind of a democracy across the globe, across the Western world, especially. So the the no party system that is proposed in Breaking Democracy's Chain, um, uh, it's a very simple concept, and it basically replaces the structure provided by the political parties on the current system. So let's start with elections, as you've said. What would it look like for your audiences, for your listeners? So I suppose at the constituency level, we probably have got to start at the constituency level. So candidates would stand as individuals without the party label. And you have that in, I believe, in Los Angeles. Mayor kind of stands without the party labels. And you probably get, is it about a 3 million population in Los Angeles? And you've got about a million or
Yeah.
so voters in there, if I'm not mistaken. Last time I've kind of checked.
Something like that, yeah.
So roughly speaking. So what we know is that in your system, you still have a non-partisan, without party labels, elections where voters vote for the individual, not the party brands. So we know it's possible and practical. It is currently being done in big cities in US. So if we look at it at a constituency level, candidates would stand as individuals like the mayors in Los Angeles without a party label. So you might say, well, there's going to be loads of candidates. How do you kind of filter those things and get it to a manageable number? They will qualify through, I suppose, demonstrated public support. For example, each candidate, if they're serious, then can collect 0.5% of voters' signatures in that constituency to become a serious contender. So when public goes to vote for their representative, you've only got the serious contenders with some serious support from the electorate, from the voters. So once you have all the representatives in the Congress, I believe you have less than us, is it 430 or so?
435, yeah.
435.
Well, in the U.S. House, there's 435, and then there's 100 U.S. senators.
Yeah, so the 435. So once these representatives are in the House of Representatives, then the presidential process, selecting a presidential process, can begin. And presidential candidates will need first demonstrate some sort of a meaningful support among the elected representatives, because ultimately we've voted for those representatives. We've sent them there to represent us. And on our behalf, they can narrow the list down. So House of Representatives would kind of, through rounds of debate and voting, they will narrow the list down to 2 finalists. So those 2 finalists then would go to a general election with their chosen running mates, as you have it in your constitution. The winning ticket, I suppose, would become the executive, whereas the runner-up can become whatever you want to call it, minority leader. In UK, we call it opposition leader. You could call it shadow president. The labels are unimportant. The importance is the role would carry a public mandate to scrutinize the executive. So that office will also appoint a shadow cabinet to present alternatives and help representatives, because don't forget, representatives are now independent, not being whipped to toe the party line. They make their own decisions with their conscience and in the best interest of their constituents. So the opposition can dissect the legislation, can put alternative proposals on the table, and then the cooperation will naturally emerge around issues and the merit of the proposed legislation. So, if you and I were representatives, we might agree and vote yes for one issue, but on the next issue, you might vote yes and I might vote no. And if the legislation kind of commands broad support from the House of Representatives, representing the wider public, then it goes through. If it doesn't, then it needs to be amended and negotiated so that it does get enough support from the representatives for it to go through. So you would have the competition, you would have the opposition, but not partisan opposition, genuine opposition looking after the best interests of the country. You'll have scrutiny and you've got stability. So that's my kind of a take on this one. You can provide all these things without the parties.
Well, that's a lot to dissect there. I do want to go back to something you said towards the beginning. So just to make sure I understand where you're coming from, the idea is that how the elections happen is not quite as much your concern. It's just as long as it's something that doesn't have parties. So
Correct.
It could look like a lot of local elections where it's, works similarly to a partisan election, except it's just nonpartisan, or it could be proportional representation or whatever. It's really just more about just getting the party impact out of that. Correct?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Gotcha. I don't know as well how much it works in other countries. I know they're tend to be much more centralized, but in America, there's a lot of our election system is very decentralized. There's a lot of the states and localities have a lot more leeway to decide how their elections work. Depending on which state you go to, they sometimes give local places a little bit more leeway in that regard. So that's an interesting point there. And now I want to go a little bit more into the
can I just kind of come in on something
Sure.
here? Now, sure. Look, I mean, I suppose what needs to be kind of elaborated on or clarified for your audience is this point. We, no doubt, you'll kind of put questions to me on various aspects and we'll deal with those, but it's important that I get this message across. What do parties do really for the electorate, for the public? So I would like your audiences to kind of think for a moment. We have filtered choice. So before you and I get to the ballot box, the choices have been filtered, because to have a party label to become a party candidate, you need the party approval in a roundabout way. Every kind of a system differs, but you don't toe the public party line. You're not on that list. So you will not have and this is why you have problems with existing or sitting representatives, re-election rate of 90% plus. You basically get them out of the job when they die, more or less. So very, very few, or they kind of go against the party they represent. So the parties have, there's kind of 3 points that I want to make on the parties. One, they filter the choice. So you haven't got a full menu to choose from. You've got filtered menu. They say you can vote 2 candidates here for Conservatives or Republicans or Democrats. Then the story doesn't end there. Once these representatives in the House, they're told which way to vote. So that's a problem. Now, in UK, we had some veteran MPs, members of parliament, your representatives equivalent. 21 of those was sacked and withdrawn, and basically their careers ended by Boris Johnson because they decided to not vote along the party lines for Brexit. So not only that the choices are filtered, but parties also, what they call discipline, they basically tell your representatives which way to vote. So this is why, if we kind of tie it back to this citizens' involvement through AI and digital platforms and what have you, it becomes meaningless when the representatives haven't got a freedom or free will to vote for legislation in line with their conscience or in line with their constituents. And then finally, the third point is, the money doesn't just, the wealthy entrenched behind the parties don't just limit their influence through selecting candidates that's loyal to them or align with their thinking. They also fund think tanks who draw up legislations and so on and so forth. And that's kind of sent to the government, and they put in the whatever you want to call it, that, you know, their advantages, what works in their benefit, rather than what works on the interest of the wider public. And this is why you'll see massive corporations, billionaires, pay very little tax. You and I will pay 30-40%, and they will be paying something like a 6 or 8%. So there's all these loopholes that's been drawn up. So parties are not really serving the voters or the public. They're really serving their masters who finance them. Sorry, I've butted in there, but carry on. Over to you.
No, it's okay. But I get what you're saying, and it is true. There is undeniable to some extent that there is filtering going on before we even get to election time, and that's not even talking about districts that are so heavily Democratic or so heavily Republican that the minority party can't possibly challenge the majority party in the election in a lot of districts. And unfortunately, you are seeing more of those uncompetitive districts. But now, as for the ultimate vision that you have, not just, talking about the symptoms of the current system, but looking towards the future. As I said up top, I don't argue for or against political views, but I will admit, though, that I have a little skepticism as to whether a partyless future can happen. It's not really about whether I think it should or shouldn't. It's just I do find it hard to believe it can happen. But I do want to get your take on some of the arguments that some people will make against your ideas, and give you a chance to rebut them and give your take on all of them. So I think, first of all, this makes sense because these are the people that are going to be the most adamantly against your proposal. What would you say to Democrats and Republicans who would argue that if you got rid of parties, that their representation would be diminished if they can't have candidates running as Democrats or Republicans? And a lot of them will use the First Amendment right to freedom of association as one of those arguments. What would you say to those people?
Okay, so under no party system that's being proposed in Breaking Democracies chains, the freedom of association remains exactly the same. So there's no restrictions or whatsoever. We want a more democratic system, not a more oppressive system. Democrats or Republicans do not need to give up their values. Their values are their values, their culture. They believe in that deeply, and we haven't got a problem with that. And on some cultural issues, I would put my hand up and admit there are cultural differences or real differences between the two parties. I suppose, broadly speaking, one tends to be more liberal and other tend to be more conservative. So that's where the divide line is. And we have a similar sort of a system here in the UK, although previously it was more of a working class and the business class kind of a thing, or upper class in UK, but that's more kind of a move towards American system. So conservative and liberals. But on, what's important, I suppose, it's kind of to highlight that when it comes to major issues, there's hardly any daylight between those two parties on issues like foreign wars. They continued under Obama, Biden, Trump, Bush. So whether you have Democrats or Republican, that continues because of the pressure from military-industrial complex. Surveillance, that has gone worse over the years, just got tighter and tighter. And both parties are equally responsible for that. So it's not that there's any difference between them. Austerity, you would expect Democrats to be better, but no, far from it. When in the 2008 crash, banks were rescued, billions, if not nearly trillion, was spent on those things. You and I and ordinary people were asked to tighten our belts and go for the austerity. So they're broadly aligned when it comes to the key issues. But that's another matter, because as I've said earlier, like Schumer, once the government is in hands of the parties, they've kind of passed laws to create the media landscape we have now, and that partisan media now pits us against one another, basically. And hence we kind of are in this situation. But another, I suppose, important point to make here is that parties restrict choice. By nature, the parties want to get into the government, and they kind of aggregate, or vote aggregators. They kind of aggregate votes, if you like. bundling many different issues into a single package. Example, Donald Trump, when he was campaigning, he was asking for the Muslim votes in US, and he's probably got them. And that's what may have tilted the balance for him to win the presidency. So you can see conservatism and the Muslim votes don't necessarily go together. They were traditionally with the Democrats. And when Biden didn't do the job that wider Muslim population expected off of him in Gaza, they've kind of drifted to go along with Donald Trump. And like yourself, I try to stay out of politics. My job is better democracy. I respect each side equally because they have genuine concerns. They're genuinely liberal, they're genuinely conservative, and I fully respect each side as long as it doesn't kind of lead to any form of violence, kind of a thing, whether it's on the right or whether it's on the left. And I think we could make the point that very few voters truly agree with everything a party stands for. You know, I might like some of the policies that are in conservative manifesto and some of the policies that are in Republican manifesto. But because of this identity, we kind of associate with one camp or the other and kind of a vote in that manner. So the voting then becomes about choosing, not really choosing what you want. It's about strategically voting to keep other side out. And that's not democracy. You want to be able to vote something that you truly believe in, not just strategically. So I'm going to vote on this election because I just don't want other guys to come in. I know my set are bad, but I just really do not want to see these other guys come in. And that's what kind of keeps the society divided. I think there's a good book by Liliana Mason, Uncivil Agreement. I don't know if you've come across that one, but as she kind of lays bare, parties have managed to fuse this cultural identity with the political identity, basically, and created what she calls this mega identity. So people are now seeing other side as existential threat, and that's not a healthy situation to be in. But removing party labels, to come back to your original question, does not mean voters abandon their beliefs. The candidate or the candidates in your constituency, they will still campaign openly on their values. And in the book, I say pledges, their policy pledges, what they're promising the electorate. So if voters want somebody with conservative values, they can vote for that candidate. If they want somebody with democratic values or liberal values, they can vote for that candidate. That's not a problem. So that choice is not taken away from them. The difference, I suppose, is that you're choosing a person and their program directly rather than choosing a party label. So you've still got these Republican or Democratic values. The representation, in other words, is not diminishing. I would agree is strengthened because you're not strategically voting. You're voting for something that you believe in, and you have a full control over it as a voter. Because if this representative consistently betrays his or her pledges to the constituents, to the voters, you can punish that person. You can punish that person at the next general election without worrying about letting other side in, because there is no other side anymore.
I think a lot of people can agree with the idea of they want something to vote for, not something against. And that is, you hear that lament all the time, as people think they're voting for the lesser of two evils, which may be a little bit harsh, because even if, some candidates are not, even if they're not fit for office, evils might be a little bit harsh. Obviously, it's just the phrase, but sometimes people really do feel that way, that it is just evil people when they don't agree. And that's, like you said, it's not healthy for democracy. But let's go more into the practical side of the debate. Obviously, the theoretical, the philosophical is important, but ultimately you do have to make this vision happen. So there are we talked about this a little bit towards the beginning. There are a lot of incentives for political parties to perform. There's a book I've shown a couple times on here on this
Yeah.
podcast called Why Parties: A Second Look by John Aldrich. That's a really great analysis of these incentives and a lot more, such as being able to more effectively advocate for their interests or more effectively mobilize voters. You talked about how that was very helpful in the early days of the United States. But so bringing that into the present day, how would you incentivize people, particularly elected officials, to get behind this idea of partyless politics?
Yeah, look, I mean, I've not put my hand up. I've not read the book by Aldrich, but I think from what I've kind of gathered from similar authors is that they kind of claim that parties organize candidates, mobilize voters, provide structure. We've talked about some of those points earlier, and make governing more manageable, I suppose, in large representative systems, because after all, we don't live in Athenian democracy where mass participation is possible. We know that's not possible. Uh, but representation in modern days can be much more responsive and can be much more accountable to the voters. So I think first and foremost, we need to deal with the coordination. Democracies do need some sort of a coordination. We've kind of answered that question earlier in the sense that we have a structure put in place of the parties where we have independent candidates, representatives in the House of Representatives, then the presidential candidates emerge and they're voted on and they form the executive and then the opposition, legal, constitutional, and mandated by the public. I think the key point to discuss here probably is how would the cooperation work and how would the alliances work and how would the structure would work? Well, it's quite simple. It's quite simple in the sense that, well, you have these representatives that's not being whipped by the party bosses to behave in a certain way, vote in a certain way. They can have a look at each legislation or proposal that comes in front of them, look at this proposal, listen to the opposition to see if there's alternatives, to see what it means, because even the representatives will need to digest this legislation and understand it. So what I'm basically saying, legislators can still cooperate, mobilize, support, and organize government. But that doesn't mean permanent politicals are the only way to achieve that structure, to that mobilization. The difference is the alliances would form issue by issue, and they will be fluid. So you're not restricting the freedom of association or voting in one way or another, but that will reflect the true will of the society as a whole. So I really don't see at all, and please do push back on this one, as to what, if we have alternative structure to political parties, what purpose would they serve? Apart from that we've been used to them for nearly 2.5 centuries. And, I would draw your listeners to another point, and that's female suffrage, the women's suffrage. Do you know it was nearly 150 years? It was only in 1920 that women had the right to vote. Now, for those 150 years, that looked unrealistic. That did not come through. Now, if you look at it from today's perspective, today's lenses, you would say, well, that's rather stupid, isn't it? Why? It's quite realistic. It's happened. So we call things unrealistic until we kind of see these things happen. And that's because I want to kind of go back and tie it all together. That's because through the party system, the entrenched elite had captured the government, passed legislation through think tanks, and because once you capture the party bosses, important people in the party, then you've captured a whole block of representatives. You basically get them to vote in the way you want. And through that, they've kind of changed the curriculum, because we've not got critically thinking public. Students, from day one, parties have been part of our everyday life, in elections, in schools, in education. And so when you say to people a democracy is possible without political parties, they say, well, yes, I can understand that. It's been 250 years. It's not easy. It's just like I suppose it sounds as radical as going to somewhere like Iran or Saudi Arabia and say you should have a democracy. People will say, no, we don't want that. That's not practical. That's not going to work here. So yes, I can understand the reason why people will see it that way, but I could never understand why in a civilized Western society we don't debate it and see if there's a better form of democracy that improves everybody's lives and really restores the power where it belongs, with the people.
Well, maybe that debate will be coming sooner rather than later. We'll see. But it is a good point. I mean, a lot of things have been realistic in the past, and then eventually they did become realistic.
Yeah.
Fun fact about women's suffrage, though, is there actually were a few states before the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. There were actually a few states that did let women vote in elections. Now, sometimes they weren't able to vote in every election, but Wyoming is nicknamed the equality state because they were actually the first state to allow for women's suffrage. And I was going to say it's something 1880 something, 1890 something. So fun little fact there that I just thought about because of what you brought up. But it is true. So, hey, maybe one day this will happen. Like I said, I am a little skeptical of whether it will happen, but it is a good point. Sometimes there's a lot of things that are realistic today that once weren't realistic. And we're human beings. We like to push the boundaries of what's possible. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, so we'll see. We are coming a little close to time, so I do want to get a couple more questions in real quick before I end with the random question of the day that I like to do. But another practical argument somebody might pose is how we might see lower voter turnout because voters won't be able to rely on that heuristic of the party where they see a Democrat or Republican and then they vote in there. And low voter turnout can be its own issue for democracy. Actually, the episode I just put out today, which by the time this episode comes out, it'll be next week, did talk about low voter turnout being a problem for representativeness in government. But in any case, what would you say to people who say that, well, if you get rid of the Democratic and Republican and all party labels, that it's going to lead to lower voter turnout?
Okay, now fair point. It is true that many voters do rely on shortcuts, and party labels are one of those shortcuts, for sure. Yeah. But this is not a good reason to preserve that party machines, because those same labels often encourage passive tribal voting rather than meaningful choice, as we've explained earlier in detail without going back over the same points. Under the party system, there are so many voters that feel frustrated and disconnected on the current system. They often say, well, my vote does not really change anything, and I'm one of those voters. So parties tend to kind of rely heavily on fear, identity politics, cultural divisions to mobilize their base rather than really inspiring the voters. And there's a problem. And besides, voters would still have clear cues, because not everybody is a political philosopher kind of a thing, so they need cues. But those cues would come from the candidates. The voters can see their top pledges they make to the constituents, for instance, whether they're Republican aligned or liberal aligned and what have you. And in practical terms, I suppose this could be made very straightforward. A public government website could list every candidate alongside with their top 10 pledges, so the voters can compare them easily. And this could be what is their position on abortion, on guns, on immigration, and so on and so forth. So the list goes on, kind of a thing. So the top 10 pledges, you will know immediately whether that person is like a Republican values or the liberal values. So you'll immediately have that. And then I suppose the same information on that website or shorter version of it could also kind of appear on the ballot paper itself. So that would give the voters something far more meaningful than just a party label.
So for you, it's more that even though it's one, albeit very common heuristic that people use, maybe arguably the most powerful one, which party they are, they're just really just going to be more relying on other mental cues instead, and maybe voter turnout will pick back up after a while then.
What I was going to say is that I think this is, over time, the voter turnout will improve because people will feel their vote matters. Because,
Gotcha.
yeah, that's the whole point. Because yes, you have cues. You want to kind of a vote tactically to keep somebody out. Whereas under the no party system, if I'm voting for Paul and I want to see if he's kind of stayed loyal to his pledges, stay true to his pledges, and then if you have, I'll say, well, I need to support this guy because he's 10 out of 10. Or if you haven't, then I say, well, look, I need to get somebody else in because this guy had betrayed us as voters. So I know my vote makes a difference. Whereas on a whole party machine nationally, it doesn't make any difference, kind of a thing. Apart from, well, I'm not going to waste my vote because I don't want to let other side on. Independence in US, 45% of the people in US identify as independents. Only, that's more than both parties put together. They're only under 20% each that people identify as Republican and Democrats, according to the 2025 survey. So yes, the cues will be there and more openly, because if I have a piece of paper that I can see Paul's picture on it and his pledges on it, and regarding money, I can see your top donors as well, so I know whether you're going to serve my interests as a voter or whether you're going to serve interest of some sort of a special interest group. Voters will be more engaged and the turnout will increase. But there's another point that needs to be made here, Paul, and that is, we assume the voter turnout is good. Well, hang on a minute. It's on the floor. Your primaries attract something like a 20% of the voters. Your main general election, where there's more enthusiasm, is 60% or so. And if you say you get, because the margin is very small between the Conservatives and Democrats, they only win by a couple of percentage points. So if you said 50% of 60% turnout, that's only 30% of the voters. That gives them the mandate. Now, look further afield. In Australia, the voter turnout was nosediving under these systems, and they brought in compulsory mandatory voting system. So if you don't go and vote, they pushed it up to 90, but if you don't go and vote, they fine you unless you have a valid reason. So the voter turnout is as it is under current party system is what I'm trying to get across.
Sure. And you do bring up a good point. The U.S. is something else I brought up in my last episode is that U.S. voter turnout is one of the lowest amongst democracies in the world. And like you said, part of it is, some countries use compulsory voting. But even so, like if you talked about primaries, if you even look at local general elections, sometimes they can be something like 15% of eligible voters that turn out to vote. It can be it used to be back in, I want to say right around the turn to the 20th century was some of our highest points of voter turnout. And since then it's been a lot lower. But that is another point to make too, is even if there is lower voter turnout with no parties, you already see very low turnout in the first place.
Well, I think we need to call a spade a spade. The voter turnout has gone down because people have lost faith in the system. That's the only explanation. They've lost faith in the system. They don't trust the system delivers for them. It doesn't matter whether it's the Reds or Blues. No matter who wins, we lose. That's my conclusion.
That is true to some extent. Some people do just not vote just because of what you said there. Just one more question before we get to the closing part here. But I did want to get to this one because I like to have, towards the end of my episodes, I want to have at least one set question dedicated to practical takeaways for listeners. Now, this might be something that's a little bit harder to make practical because it's a very broad forward vision, but what are 2 to 3 actionable tips you'd like to give to people when it comes to pushing back against a two-party system and possibly ushering in a partyless system?
Okay. I think my number one would be to kind of recognize what is being proposed here is not a utopian fantasy. In the United States, as I said earlier, 45% of the adult voters do not belong to either major party. So there is already dissatisfaction. So this is not a utopian fantasy. That's the first message I want to kind of get across to people. It needs a serious look at to discuss it, because we deserve a better system, a more democratic system. Second, and probably even more importantly, realize power of your vote as citizens. Please, please, please. I know I'm not a good example. I said, out of frustration, I did not vote. Realize power of your vote. It is the most powerful tool in the world. Why is that? Because you can use it either to choose genuine representatives free from the party filter, or keep performing the ritual that legitimizes this broken system. So that is my second, but probably more important point, is to realize the power of your vote is the most powerful thing in the world. Finally, on third point, I would advocate a citizens' super PAC for independent democracy, because, money is flooding these political parties. So what we need is a super PAC for independent democracy, independent candidates. And we need to build that sport, the sport from the whole nation, maybe, like-minded people, that 45% that don't associate with these parties, in order for the independents to effectively compete with the party candidates. So this national no-party movement that pulls small donations from across the nation, builds network, identifies target seats, and strategically kind of backs candidates in one or two constituencies at a time so that they become viable. A similar sort of a kind of a setup exists in Australia. I think they call it Climate 200, which is a similar kind of a sport. They pool the money, they get all the small donations from the public, and they counter these big monies behind big parties, and they support independent candidates. They've got about 10 independent candidates, if not more, in Australia. So it's possible. So I think we need this super PAC to get behind the independence, because nobody in power in history has ever let go of that power voluntarily or out of decency. They will hold on to that power. So it's got to come from the grassroots. It's got to come from the people that demand better. And that's how we will get to this system. So to recap, know the power of your vote, have an open mind that better system is possible, and disenfranchised voters get behind independence and create a super PAC for independent democracy is my practical tips.
Okay, well, for those of you at home, like to hear your takes on all that. Well, of course, the whole episode, but also hear about what you had to say, what Metin had to say there for the practical takeaways. But since we're pushing up on time, I'm going to go ahead and get to the final part of this interview. So for my interviews, for anybody, for obviously for you, Metin, and for anybody here who listening to this episode who hasn't listened to this podcast before, I like to end things with a random, non-political, fun question, just to round things out and just to add a little levity to things. So, yeah. Metin, today's random question of the day for you is, what is one of your unpopular food opinions?
Unpopular?
Yes.
Sorry, say that again. I missed it.
What is one of your unpopular food opinions?
Food opinion. Oh, unpopular food opinion. Now then.
It's all right. Let it out. Let it out.
Well, I mean, in which way? I'm trying to kind of work out my opinion on.
Here,
it's a broad question.
Is there a food that a whole lot of people like, and you're like, I'm not about that? Like, I'll tell you, pickles suck. I hate pickles. I don't get why anybody likes pickles.
Yeah. I would say sushi, Japanese food.
Sushi.
Yeah, sushi. Yeah,
okay.
I could not touch raw fish.
No, I'm not a sushi guy either.
Yeah,
I will say one of my, I think it's unpopular, because it seems to be happening more and more often here. So you're in UK. I don't know if the English Premier League teams do this in their arenas, but there's a thing in American professional sports places that for some reason they really feel the need to mix foods together that absolutely do not need to be, like putting like hot dogs and ice cream and stuff like that. What are we doing? This is so dumb, and you're just adding to this stereotype of Americans being food slobs. I just because you can do it, it's like that. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Jurassic Park, but
Oh, yes.
Jeff
Yeah.
Goldblum's character,
Yeah.
you're so preoccupied with whether you could, you never stop to think about whether you should. We
Yeah.
don't need to be mixing all these disparate foods together. I've never understood it. They're perfectly fine by themselves. Just stop
I
it with
agree.
this.
I agree. You'd be pleased to know that whatever happens in America, a few years later, is in UK. So we're not far
Okay.
behind you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, in this case, that's a shame. But yeah, no, that's one of the things that just drives me crazy. And I like to try to focus on some of those things that don't matter and get mad about those, so I don't
It's good
blow up at things that do matter.
Yeah. It's good to
But,
let steam out. We're human beings.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, indeed.
But yeah, no, pickles also do suck. I hate pickles. I don't get why they're put on burgers.
I'm good with my burgers and pickles, definitely.
Okay, well, hey, you can go ahead and have all the pickles that would be on my burger.
Yeah, perfect combination.
There you go. But anyways, we are going to have to wrap things up here. So Metin, thank you so much for being on here. Obviously, I'll share a link to your book. Is there any other link that you want to share?
No, it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. Thank you. So yes, that's perfect.
Okay. I will put that link in the show notes. And then, of course, my links, my Facebook, LinkedIn, medium.com profile, my email, my website, and paulrader.org and paulraderwrites@gmail.com. And my 5-day educational email course about how we can more effectively depolarize politics in America. Because a lot of the ways that we try to depolarize politics is actually ineffective and sometimes has the opposite effect. And that EEC, educational email course, talks about ways to counteract that. So that's going to end things here. So thank you so much, Metin, and thank you so much for all of you listening. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and share the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else this eventually pops up in the future. So we're going to end it off here. So thank you so much again, and we'll see you.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Absolutely. And we'll see you next time.